Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for both Historic Anthology 7 and Explorer Anthology 3, which will be the next sets that release on Arena. I believe they're coming out on the 18th, so less than a week till they come out now, and there's some really interesting cards in here. So the Historic Anthology is only going to be legal in Historic, and obviously Historic Brawl as well, and then the Explorer Anthology is going to be legal in both Explorer and Historic. So I'm going to start off here by looking at all the cards from the Historic Anthology, mainly because that's the one I'm most excited for. I definitely think this one just has the most bangers in it. So starting off here with Unearth, which is a card that I'm really excited for. I've really wanted this card in Arena for a long time, and there have been a lot of decks that I've built in the past that really wanted this sort of card. So 1 mana to be able to bring back a creature with mana value 3 or less is really good on rate, and the fact you have a cycling 2 basically means that this is never dead as well, and there's already a ton of really great homes for it. You know, the Jund colours have really good 3-drops. You know, we've obviously got Crucius, Seasoned Pyromancer, and Jarsoul, and I think Jarsoul specifically works really well with Unearth because you can potentially go, you know, Unearth Jarsoul from your graveyard, then immediately trigger it to cast Unearth from your graveyard, getting back another creature like a Crucius or a Orcish Bowmasters or something like that. Or you could even just, you know, cycle away Unearth on turn 2, and then it's just in your graveyard later, so then when you draw a Jarsoul later in the game, you can just go Jarsoul, flashback Unearth to get back another creature like a Crucius or an Orcish Bowmasters or something like that. So definitely think that a Jund build could be very interested in this sort of card. I also think it's going to be a really big pickup for Greasefang, specifically Mardu Greasefang, because being able to get Greasefang back from your graveyard for 1 mana is really strong. And my version of that deck also runs Goblin Engineer and Phyrexian Dragon Engine as well, and being able to unearth Phyrexian Dragon Engine is really good redundancy for this sort of effect. So definitely going to be a really big pickup for the Greasefang deck. And then it also works really nicely with Lurrus. Now, the annoying thing with Lurrus, if you are running it as your companion, obviously that means that all the other creatures in your deck are only going to be mana value 2 or less, so you're not getting the full value of this unless you're unearthing your Lurrus. But being able to unearth your Lurrus is incredibly strong, and I think there are a lot of good Lurrus shells that will want Unearth, specifically if you're running Snapcaster Mage. I think Snapcaster Mage also works really well with Unearth because you can Unearth the Snapcaster Mage to then flashback Unearth to get back another creature, which is a really cool line. And, you know, typically those sorts of decks can also run stuff like Orcish Bowmasters, potentially Death Shadow if you're running a Grixis build as well. So I definitely think there's a ton of homes for Unearth, and I'm really excited to play with this card. Probably the first card I'm going to be bringing with when this set drops. The next up we've got Giver of Runes, which is a really cool card to get now because the 1 mana protection creatures like Selfless Savior and Skrelv are all basically unplayable right now because of Orcish Bowmasters. So getting Giver of Runes, which is generally just better than those in general anyway, but the fact this has 2 toughness means it's going to be playable. So I think the first homes I think of when I think of this card are potentially decks like Auras or Hammer Time as well, but I've also been working on a Mardu Winota deck that's really been lacking a good 1-drop non-human. You know, I've been running Blazing Rootwaller still, but the fact that has 1 toughness is kind of rough into Bowmasters, so Giver of Runes is like the perfect card. It's basically the card that deck was missing, so that's another deck I'm going to be slotting this straight into. But getting Giver of Runes is just really nice for these sorts of decks that their whole game plan just revolves around protecting a creature. Stuff like Winota, stuff like Auras is really going to like this, so definitely a big deal, especially the 2 toughness when Bowmasters is everywhere right now. Then we're also getting Bloodghast, which is, I'm really excited for this one as well. This is a card that I've really wanted to read for a long time, and this also has a number of homes. So first of all, if you play the kind of Dredgeless Dredge deck in Best of 1 with the Prized Amalgam and Narcomoeba and stuff, this is a really good slot there. You know, just great if you're milling yourself over and then just getting it back whenever you play a land drop. But it also fits really nicely into Sacrifice Shells. Now, Sacrifice hasn't really been popular recently, but, you know, with the addition of Samwise and, you know, the increase in popularity of Yawgmoth combo, I'll get more into that later because Yawgmoth is getting a really big addition in one of the anthologies as well. But this seems like it could be a really good addition to Sacrifice decks if you're running stuff like Deadly Dispute and stuff like that, you know, ways to sacrifice your creature to take advantage of it, and then just looping it from the graveyard whenever you play a land. And it's also a Vampire as well. You know, I have seen some Vampire lists running this. It's kind of a nice synergy with stuff like Saurian Imperious Bloodlord, and we do have some decent Vampires in Historic. I think specifically Cordial Vampire is an incredibly underplayed card, and getting access to Bloodghast could be a big boost to that archetype. That means it might see more experimentations. So Bloodghast, another one that is really cool card and could potentially fit in a number of decks as well. Then next up we've got Tribal Flames, which is a really nice another nice payoff for being Domain. I think right now, you know, Domain has been kind of on the downswing recently, just because I'm not sure, you know, I think Leyline Binding is incredibly well positioned right now, but the cut consistency of your mana base doesn't really feel like it's worth it just for Leyline Binding and Territorial Carvu, but the fact we're getting Tribal Flames does mean that we have another payoff, and 2 mana, deal 5 to any target, even at sorcery speed, is really good. It's, great for removal in general, very good at being able to kill stuff like Shieldred if you do need to use it against a creature, but being able to deal 5 damage directly to face just gives you really good reach in the late game, so I definitely expect the domain decks to be running this. It's going to be a big boost to that archetype for sure. Speaking of which, we're also getting Wild Nacatl, which is a really interesting card for, this is seen in, I think in Modern they run Domain Aggro or Domain Zoo, I guess they call it, but I'm not really sure this is going to translate as well in Historic, just because the mana base doesn't really enable you to play Domain Aggro. It kind of works in Modern because you have fetch lands, so you can consistently hit Domain in the first few turns while still having untapped lands. In Historic without fetch lands, I think that's a lot more difficult to do. To consistently get Domain in the early game, you either have to be running Triomes or the new Land Cyclers, and neither of which are very good with aggro because, they basically make you play a turn behind. So I don't think Wild Nacatl is really going to enable Domain aggro in Historic, just because I don't think the mana base is good enough. But if you're running a Naya aggro deck, if you're running an aggro deck in Naya colours, this does seem like a really good one-drop. Getting a 1-mana 3/3 is pretty sick. So if you're running a Naya aggro deck, this seems good. I am kind of pessimistic on Domain aggro in Historic, but I'd love to be proved wrong. So if you do find out a good build, definitely let me know in the comments. Next up, we've got Bloodbraid Elf, which is a really bittersweet card for me because I've been wanting this card in Historic, or just on Arena in general, for a really long time. I think this card is really sweet, but I think it's just come too late. Now that we have the One Ring in Historic, I don't think there's any real reason that you would run this over the One Ring. Specifically, I think Bloodbraid Elf is going to be at its best in mid-range decks. So stuff like Jund mid-range, being able to go Bloodbraid Elf into Crucius, into Fable, into Pyromancer, into Jostle seems so sick, but it's just not as good as the One Ring. And I think if you're running a mid-range deck right now, One Ring and Shielded is almost definitely the best way to go. So maybe if the One Ring does get banned eventually, Bloodbraid Elf could see play, but right now, I can't really think of a deck that would prefer to be running Bloodbraid Elf over the One Ring, so kind of sucks because I was really excited to get my hands on this card, but as long as the One Ring's legal, not sure this is better. I mean, if you're running an aggro deck, then I could potentially see this being better, but even then, if you are going to consistently hit 4 mana in your aggro deck, I still think the One Ring might even be better there, just to give you a way to refuel, but, the one home I could see this in is in an aggro deck. But yeah, we'll have to see. I really hope it does see play, but with the One Ring legal, I'm not 100% sure on this one. Then we've got Vendilion Clique, which is another card I'm really excited for right now. It does have 1 toughness, which is pretty rough in the Bowmasters meta, but I've recently been brewing a lot of decks, similar to the Dimir list that I posted recently, that plays a lot at instant speed, because I think playing at instant speed is really good right now when some of the best threats in the format, like Crucius, One Ring, and Shieldred, are all pretty expensive sorceries, so being able to play counter spells at instant speed seems really nice. And this as another flash payoff is really nice. I was looking for a good 3-drop to play in that sort of deck, and this seems like a really good one, and it's also a wizard as well, and that's another thing I was looking for. I've recently been trying out a lot of Flame of Anor decks. I think Flame of Anor, if you can, sometimes get the upside off it, is really nice. And, I think that the easiest wizard to run it alongside is Snapcaster Mage if you are running kind of an instant speed interactive deck. But Vendilion Clique, could work really well in potentially a Grixis Shell alongside your Orcish Bowmasters and your Snapcaster Mages. And then you've got Vendilion Clique and Snapcaster Mage as 8 wizards you could potentially run to trigger Flame of Anor, which seems pretty sick. So I'm definitely going to be trying it out. Having the 1 toughness is definitely the biggest drawback of it, because it does just die to Bowmasters, like most of the other threats that sort of deck runs. But I'm definitely going to be trying it out, and I would love for a Grixis Shell with Flame of Anor and Bowmasters to be really good. This definitely a card I'm going to be trying out for sure. Then we've got another cycle of lands that I'm really excited for. So these are, I think they're called the Horizon lands in Modern, and we're getting the blue-red one, the red-white one, the green-black one, the white-black one, and the green-blue one. And these cards are all really good quality. I mean, in general, I think you're going to prefer to run these in aggro decks, but getting essentially a pain land that can draw you a card for just the cost of 2 mana, right? Obviously, you do lose the land as well, but this really helps to mitigate flood in aggro decks. And just, low to the ground decks in general are really going to like this. So, it is kind of like Mana Confidence where you can't avoid paying the life. But generally, like I said, if you're playing this in an aggro deck, the life loss really doesn't matter. And so I definitely expect these to see a lot of play. The blue-red one is going to slot straight into Izzet Wizards, I imagine. Red-white one could see play in like Burn or just red-white aggro decks in general. The green-black one could see play in Yawgmoth. The other nice way to offset the life loss of this is if you're running a deck that's naturally running life gain, for example. So if you are running a Yawgmoth, you're running Prosperous Innkeeper, potentially Shielded as well. Although having said that, actually, maybe not, because you do want to preserve your life total for Yawgmoth itself. But, you know, I definitely imagine there'll be some green-black decks, especially the more low-to-the-ground ones that want this as well. The white-black one, you know, again, there are white-black tokens decks floating around at the moment, but I've also been experimenting with a lot of Mardu decks that could want this as well. And then the green-blue one, probably Merfolk might be interested in this as well. So definitely a lot of homes straight away, and I imagine that this is going to be a land that's always going to be a consideration if you're running a two-colour aggro deck specifically. And then next up we've got Sword of Fire and Ice, which is, I think, widely regarded as probably the best sword that we have access to, and the fact we're getting it in Arena is really nice. Previously, I think like Sword of Forge and Frontier was the best one that we have had access to on Arena, which was pretty good. I do think Fire and Ice is probably an upgrade on it. I mean, drawing a card as opposed to being able to exile it and play is obviously worse against Bowmaster specifically, but the fact that this does act as, you know, kind of extra interaction is pretty nice. Now, the awkward thing about this card is that I just don't think it really has a good home outside of the Thopterblade deck. I think this is definitely a card that fits pretty nicely into Thopterblade, and it'll be interesting to test out how this does compare to Sword of Forge and Frontier, because that's the main one I've been running in the past. But Thopterblade is definitely going to like this a lot, you know, with Fervent Champion. I've still not got around to testing it with the new Frodo as well, so this seems like a really nice upgrade to that deck. But outside of that, without Stoneforge Mystic, I don't really think this is going to slot anywhere else, right? You either have to be very all-in on being able to equip stuff for cheap, like the Thopterblade deck does, because you know, in Modern, you can run Stoneforge Mystic to just run this as a one-of, and so, yeah, outside of Thopterblade, I don't really think there's a good home for it, which is a shame, because it's a really cool card for sure. Then next up, we've got the Titan cycle, so we've got all the Titans. We've got Primeval, Sun Titan, Frost Titan, Grave Titan. Hold on, have I missed one here? Give me a second. Oh, and Inferno Titan. Whoops, let me get that one up. I forgot to bring that one up. But these are, you know, obviously very iconic cards from Magic's past. Here we go, yeah, Inferno Titan. So this is the red one. And I think the most playable out of these are probably Primeval Titan and Sun Titan. But even then, I think they just got outclassed in Historic by now, right? 6 mana needs to be incredibly powerful to see play in Historic. Now, obviously, Primeval Titan is still played in bigger formats, but I just don't think we have good enough lands that this is worth it, right? If we had Field of the Dead or Valakut, then I definitely think there would be, you know, a Primeval Titan deck, but from what we have at the moment, you know, the most natural home for it is potentially Mono Green Devotion as a way to find Nykthos, but, you know, you would have to run this probably instead of Storm the Festival. I don't think it's really better than Storm the Festival. You can't really run it alongside Storm the Festival because it's 6 mana as opposed to 5, so unless there's a ton of extra utility lands that you would want to be getting in Devotion, I don't think this is really going to see play there. Outside of that, we're also getting Thespian Stage in the Explorer Anthology, which you could pair with Lotus Field, so you could potentially use this to get Lotus Field, Thespian Stage, but at that point you're just using, you know, you'd have had to ramp into Primeval Titan to get it out in the first place, and so, you know, I'm not sure ramping into extra ramp is really what you want to be doing with this card. So obviously Primeval Titan has a very high ceiling, particularly as we get more lands added. You know, if we do eventually get Valakut, then this is definitely a card I want to return to, but I think with the lands we have access to now, it's just not really worth it for 6 mana, and I just don't think there's a really good home for it either. But again, I would love to be proved wrong because it is a really cool card. Then Sun Titan is, again, probably the next closest to playable, but even then, like I said, 6 mana, you need to be so powerful to see play in Historic as a 6 mana card. And, you know, getting a 3-drop back from the graveyard is pretty nice on a 6/6 body, but I just think it's too expensive and there's not really going to be a good home for it, you know. Obviously, if you're running a Mardu Shell, you could be running Crucius and Fable of the Mirror Breaker, but I think right now you just much rather run Ring and Shieldred instead of something like Sun Titan. So, again, cool card, but I think it's just been power crept out of Historic. And same sort of thing with the other ones, you know, Frost Titan, you know, it's going to be really rough for blue to ever get to 6 mana, and the effect isn't really that powerful for a 6 mana card. Grave Titan is kind of generically powerful, but again, you know, 6 mana card just going to be too expensive. There's a lot more powerful things you can be doing in the format for 6 mana. And then similar thing with Inferno Titan as well. You know, again, cool card, but I just think Historic has just got too powerful for these sorts of cards to really see much play. Competitively anyway, I'm sure they'll be good in stuff like Historic Brawl or if you're just building a deck casually, but yeah, unfortunately I don't think these are going to see much play unless we get some extra lands to use with Primeval Titan. And then next up we've got Worn Powerstone, which is a really interesting mana rock because it's 3 mana and it gives you 2 mana, so I think it's the best mana rock that we have access to in terms of mana generation at 3 mana. And that is interesting because I have been experimenting with, Paradox Engine 1 ring decks recently, and also a little bit with Forsaken Monument decks, which I guess are the 2 main places that you might play this card, but I think it being 3 mana is just too expensive, unfortunately. If you are running One Ring Paradox Engine, you would much rather be running the 2 mana rocks, because they can enable you to ramp into One Ring and Karn and stuff like that on turn 3. And, in general, I much prefer trying to run them alongside Moonsnare Prototype and Springleaf Drum because they're even cheaper. So I think One Powerstone is a really interesting card, but I think the only 2 homes I can really think of that it fits into right now are the Colorless Forsaken Monument decks and Paradox Engine, and I think it's just too slow for either of those decks. Those sorts of decks really want the 2 mana ones instead. But again, maybe like the Eggs deck is a deck that I haven't really had much experience with, like the Mystic Forge decks. That see a lot of play in best of 1. I don't know if this will be good there. It does enter tapped, which is kind of rough, but so it is a cool card. I think it's the best in slot for a 3 mana rock, but in general, the 3 mana rocks aren't really that playable. So I wouldn't be shocked if this just doesn't see play, unfortunately. The next up we've got Wayfarer's Bauble, which is a really interesting card because it enables decks of any color to potentially ramp. If you play this on turn 1 and then activate it on turn 2, you can potentially get up to 4 mana on turn 3, which is pretty nice, but as I just mentioned, we already have the 2 mana rocks that are colorless anyway, right? So you could just run Mind Stone or Cold Steel Heart or Guardian Idol instead of this. So unless I'm missing something with this, I just don't think this one's going to see much play, to be honest. And it seems much worse to draw later in the game than those as well, because all of these mana rocks outside Cold Steel Heart also give you some other benefit once they're in play. I guess it's safer to have your ramp as a land than an artifact. So if you're worried about artifact removal, this might be better, but I just can't see a deck where you would prefer to run this over something like Mind Stone. So again, probably a card that's going to see a lot of play in Historic Brawl, but I don't think this is going to really see much play in actual Historic. The next one we've got Echoing Decay, which is a pretty interesting removal spell. So it's basically just 2 mana, give a creature -2/-2, and then all other creatures with the same name. So I guess the main thing you're trying to use with this is against tokens, right? If the opponent has a lot of the same type of token, then this seems like an interesting option. I mean, this would have potentially been good when Field of the Dead was everywhere. That's like the first deck I really think of where this would have been a good sideboard card, but I just don't think this lines up very well against the majority of the format right now, unfortunately. If Krenko was really popular, that's maybe a consideration, but again, you'd much rather just kill the Krenko rather than the tokens itself, so it's an interesting effect to have access to, but I just don't think it lines up very well against the current format right now, so but definitely one to bear in mind in future in case a deck that produces a lot of tokens with the same name suddenly becomes popular. The next time we've got Repeal, which is a card I've definitely seen online in the past, but it just doesn't seem very powerful to me. I don't think even the blue interactive decks would really want this because it seems pretty bad going second, right? If the opponent plays a 2-drop, you have to wait a whole turn cycle to be able to pay 3 mana to bounce it and draw a card. So maybe I'm underestimating this one, but it just doesn't really seem powerful enough to see play in Historic to me. And then next we've got Acidic Slime, which is kind of another slightly iconic card. I've seen this one quite a lot. But again, I just don't think it's powerful enough to see play in Historic. Again, 5 mana, you need to be very good, potentially game winning to see play. And the fact this does destroy lands is pretty interesting. That is the kind of unique effect on this creature that we haven't really seen on any other creature outside of something like Ruin Blaster in the past. So maybe if there's a way to abuse that, as if you're running a blink deck that needs a way to close the game out, being able to blink Acidic Slime and just destroy the opponent's land seems interesting, but that's like the only potential home I could even see for it. And even then, blink decks aren't really common right now, and I think you'd probably much rather run something like Elish Norn at 5 mana. So again, I think it's a cool card, but I just think Historic has gotten too powerful for this sort of thing really to see play. Same sort of thing with Tooth and Nail. I think this card is just so expensive, right? I don't think there's a single 7 mana card that sees play in Historic. I occasionally see Emergent Ultimatum, and that oftentimes literally reads 7 mana win the game, and that's just too slow in the format right now anyway. So again, probably one that's focused on Historic Brawl rather than Historic itself. And then finally we've got Mortarpod, which is an interesting card, but I just don't. I just can't think of a good home for it, really. Right? You know, if you can cheat the equip cost and have a bunch of cheap creatures, this seems interesting. But there's no deck in Historic that really does that. And again, that seems quite quite low ball, quite dirtly sort of thing to be doing anyway. So interesting card, but I just can't really think of a good home for it in Historic right now, unfortunately. And so those were all the Historic Anthology cards. So as I mentioned, those are only going to be legal in Historic and Historic Brawl. So next up, we're going to move on to the Explorer Anthology. So this is going to be legal in both Explorer and Historic as well. So starting off here with Chord of Calling, which I think this card is going to have a huge impact, mainly in Historic though. I think in Explorer, the only Pioneer deck that runs Chord of Calling right now that I'm aware of is Elves. So if you're an Elves gamer and you're playing Elves in Explorer, this does seem like a pretty good upgrade there. But I think this is going to be a huge upgrade to Golgari Yawgmoth in Historic, which I already think is one of the best decks in the format, honestly. I feel like it's a pretty underplayed deck, and it's always really scary and really powerful whenever I come up against it. And Chord of Calling is the card that deck has been missing, you know. Having to run Eldritch Evolution, it's a reasonable card, but Chord is exactly what the Yawgmoth deck was missing, and I'm kind of concerned about the power level of this deck after this releases. I'm definitely going to be trying out Yawgmoth, and I definitely expect it to, if not see a lot of play, just be incredibly powerful anyway. In terms of other decks that might want this, I also think the Samwise combo deck is going to be very interested in this as well. It kind of plays a similar game to Yawgmoth, but I just think Yawgmoth is generally better from my experience, but going to be a nice pickup there. And then, again, there could be other decks that are interested in this. Historic Elves is another deck that hasn't really ever had success in best of 3, but you might want this in Elves, maybe in best of 1 to be able to tutor stuff to deal with specific scenarios, maybe instead of Karn potentially. So you could see playing Elves in Historic as well, but I think mainly Historic Yawgmoth is going to be where this has the most impact for sure, and I am kind of concerned about that deck once Chord does get released. The next up we got Shrapnel Blast, which is another card I've been wanting for quite a while, and I already think of a couple homes that I'm excited to try this in, but again, mainly in Historic. I think the only real place I've seen this play in Pioneer, so when we're talking about Explorer playable, is in Soul Artifact decks, which have never really been playable in Explorer, or have never really been that good, and also in Only Cult Anvil decks. I do think Anvil, and sort of the Sacrifice Shell in general, is still playable in Explorer, and this does seem like a pretty nice upgrade specifically for Anvil variants because you have a bunch of artifacts lying around. So I think this definitely could see play in Explorer in Anvil shells. If in Soul Artifact decks do pop up again, then this could maybe see play, but they're typically blue-white. You would have to splash into red to get access to this. So Explorer, I could see it seeing play in Anvil, but in Historic, there's definitely a couple homes I'm really excited for this in. First of all is Red-White Thopters. So I think for a very long time now, the blue-white artifact aggro deck has generally been much better than the red-white version. First of all, because you have access to counter spells. I think Divine Purge and Brotherhood's End are still massive issues for those sorts of decks, and so having access to blue for hard counter spells is one of the biggest reasons why the blue version has been better. Now, when we have Reprieve in the format, I do think that issue is less pronounced for the red-white version of the deck. The other thing is that the blue-white version generally just has better card quality anyway, right? You have stuff like Soul Artifact and the Meta Tech as well, which is pretty nice. But I do think that red-white could see a resurgence, or you could even go Jeskai potentially. I think the mana is definitely good enough where you could go Jeskai. So this definitely seems like a nice pickup for those sorts of low-to-the-ground artifact decks, just to give you really good reach in the late game, right? It's very common for you to get your opponent below 5 life, and then if they do get blockers in play, you can just fire off Shrapnel Blast to deal 5 directly to the opponent, which is a pretty nice way to close games out. And then the other home I'm really excited for this is in the Paradox Engine deck that I posted a little while back. The first deck I posted after the Lord of the Rings set dropped. And my biggest issue with that deck was that I just couldn't beat Shieldred, right? The deck was very good and resilient and could combo with Paradox Engine fairly easily, but I just couldn't deal with Shieldred and blue-white. I just didn't have a good way to deal with it. And I feel like you could potentially just go red-blue or maybe even Jeskai in that deck, and Shrapnel Blast just gives you a way to kill Shieldred at instant speed, which seems really big when your deck is very heavily built around the wrong ring. So definitely be trying it out there as well. And then again, there are other artifact decks that see play in Historic that I definitely think would be interested in this as well. So another really big upgrade, but again, kind of weird that the two most impactful cards from the Explorer Anthology look like they'll have the biggest impact in Historic. And next up we've got Sylvan Scrying, which is, I think, mainly going to be here to try and make the Lotusfield deck more playable. Now, the Lotusfield deck hasn't been playable at all in Explorer, mainly just because of the absence of Thespian stage, which we're getting in this anthology. So I do think there's potential for that deck to see play. I'm not an expert on that deck, but I think not having hidden strings seems like the biggest issue. I think hidden strings, from what I've seen and what I've heard, is a very important part of that deck, and so not getting that might mean that it's not powerful enough to see play in Explorer. It is pretty interesting in Historic though, because Lotus Field combo obviously without Thespian stage hasn't really worked. We still have access to Underworld Breach in Historic, which is a card that I believe was banned in part because it was so good in the Lotus Field combo deck in Pioneer. So there's a chance that Lotus Field combo could work in Historic, but again, I'm not familiar enough with the deck to really know whether it would work without hidden strings, but it's also another deck that I think could potentially get an upgrade from the One Ring as well. So it'd be interesting to see if Lotus Field combo does pop up in either Explorer or Historic because of this. Again, not having hidden strings is a little bit rough, but there's a chance you might be able to make it work without that. Speaking of which, as I mentioned, Thespian stage is now added to the format, and this is obviously very good alongside the Lotus Field. I think the whole idea is you need 2 Lotus Fields in play, so you typically want to get 1 Lotus Field, then get a Thespian stage to copy it, and then you just have access to a ton of mana, can have this combo turn where you just go off and then usually win with Emergent Ultimatum from what I've seen. But Thespian stage does mean that we could potentially enable the Lotus Field combo, and it's also nice with Lotus Field generally. Some blue-white control decks tend to run Lotus Field as well, so this could be a nice way in those sorts of decks to just get really far ahead on mana, which does seem pretty nice with the One Ring. I think my biggest issue with the One Ring when I've been playing it in specifically blue-white control has been that you just get choked on mana too often and end up having to discard to hand size. So if you do have Lotus Field and you can start copying it with Thespian stage, that seems like a really nice way to be able to just keep drawing off the One Ring and be able to cast everything you find off it, which is pretty nice. But having said that, typically the blue-white control decks are very heavily built around Archmage's Charm, and so you would have to run this in the Field of Ruin slot, which does then make you more weak to creature lands. And I think typically the big issue that I've had with Lotus Field control in the past is that since you're having to run filler cards to enable your Lotus Field, the deck is slightly less consistent anyway. But having said that, I do think Tail's End is pretty well positioned right now, so I definitely think I'm going to be trying out blue-white Lotus Field control and see if Thespian stage is a big upgrade there as well. Then next up we get both Worldspine Wurm and Xenagos, which is basically just here for creativity. So this is just a way to win off creativity X=2, and I believe is the most popular version of creativity in Pioneer, right? The whole idea of that deck is you run stuff like Big Score, get multiple treasures in play, then go creativity X=2, get both Worldspine Wurm and Xenagos, and then you basically make make the Worldspine Wurm really huge and give it give it haste with the Xenagos, and then just attack him for lethal that way. And I do think this is going to have an impact in Historic as well. I think the main way to win it with creativity in Historic right now with X=2 was Gristlebrand plus Chiesa. And I'm not sure that's really a good strategy anymore when both Shieldred and Orcish Bowmasters are Revera right now. So if you do want to play creativity and you're going for the full combo version for X=2, I do think Worldspine Wurm and Xenagos is probably the way to go. So I definitely think this is going to have an impact in both Explorer and Historic for the creativity deck for sure. And then next up we got Voice of Resurgence, which is another card I've been wanting for quite a while now, and is a really good hate piece against decks that are trying to interact with you at instant speed, specifically against Control. The issue with this is that I'm not sure it really has a great home right now. I think the most popular place it sees play in Pioneer right now is in kind of the 4-color Elementals deck with, the Omnaths and Risen Reef and stuff like that. And so I think this is a nice upgrade for that sort of deck, but that deck isn't really top tier right now. And a lot of the other decks that have wanted this in the past, stuff like Naya Winota or just straight green-white value collected company, aren't. I mean, obviously Winota is banned in Explorer and also is nerfed in Historic to the point where I don't really think Naya is the best way to build it anymore, because the advantage of Naya was you could swarm the battlefield with a bunch of non-humans and then get multiple Winota triggers, and you only get one Winota trigger now. So I think this is definitely a nice card to have, and there have been multiple decks in the past that I've wanted this sort of effect in, but I just don't really think there's a good home for it right now outside of the Explorer Elementals deck, but definitely one that's on my radar, and I could definitely see including this in the main deck or potentially the sideboard of certain creature decks, so we'll have to see. And next we've got Abbot of Keral Keep, which is a nice card for kind of low to the ground prowess decks. I think this does see play in the Boros Pioneer decks that I've seen floating around in Pioneer recently, so if you wanted to play that deck in Explorer, this seems like a nice upgrade there. Also does seem potentially powerful in kind of burn prowess style decks in Historic, but again, You know, it has 1 toughness, so it does get killed by Orcish Bowmasters. Having said that, it does have prowess, so, you know, it does have more counterplay. If you do just hold up an instant, you can kind of blank the Bowmasters as removal, but definitely an interesting card, and while it's not going to have a massive effect, it's nice to have access to in these sort of Spellslinger decks for sure. Then we get Deathrite Shaman, which is a really interesting card, because this is obviously incredibly powerful in formats where you have fetch lands and you can use it to ramp. Without fetch lands, you know, it's going to be interesting to see if this one sees play. I don't believe it sees much play in Pioneer at all. I don't. So my inkling is that it might be useful in very specific decks, but I don't think this one is going to see that much play. But I'd love to be proven wrong. Again, I don't think, you know, the only fetch lands that are even, you know, slightly viable in Explorer and Historic are Fabled Passage, and I don't think that card is good enough to see play unless you're running, you know, say you're running like an Omnath deck with the new Nissa from the Aftermath set. Maybe Fabled Passage is worth running there, and you might want Deathrite Shaman there, but you can only run for Fabled Passage. It means that you're having lands entering tapped in the first 3 turns, which is pretty bad. So my initial impression on this one is that it's probably not going to be good enough without fetch lands, but again, it's a really cool card. It has 2 toughness, so it survives Bowmaster, so I would love to be proven wrong on this one. We'll have to see how it plays out. And then next up, we've got the charm cycle. So we've got Izzet Charm, Golgari Charm, Simic Charm, Gruul Charm, and Orzhov Charm. And again, I'm not, you know, thrilled about these. I think Izzet Charm is the most playable, and I could potentially, you know, see this scene play in some decks. I think, annoyingly, like, it's probably too kind of jack of all trades, master of none to see play in a deck like Phoenix. I think Phoenix in general much prefers to have 1 mana spells, just so getting back Phoenix from the graveyard is easier to do. I think Phoenix in Explorer isn't really powerful enough. I think Phoenix in Historic right now is really punished by, you know, Shieldred and Orcish Bowmasters being 2 of the most popular cards right now, so I don't really think that deck is going to see much play in either of those formats. Outside of that, though, you could potentially run this in like an Izzet Control Shell, maybe an Izzet Tempo Shell. You know, there have been some decks in the past where I would have liked this sort of effect. You know, maybe, I was going to say maybe in Creativity, but Creativity in Pioneer already doesn't run this. But I do think that this is a card that is flexible enough that I'm sure there will be some Izzet decks in future that I might be interested in playing this. The other charms, though, I'm not really that convinced about. So Golgari Charm, you know, the best ability on this is to destroy an enchantment, and that's not super relevant right now, so I can't really think of a deck that would want this in either format, really. Simic Charm, again, not really that great. You know, you can bounce a creature or give your creature hexproof or pump. Neither of these effects are very exciting, and again, I don't think there's any deck in either format that would really want this. Same sort of thing with the Gruul Charm. You know, dealing 3 to each creature with flying maybe could see sideboard play if a deck with a lot of small flyers is seeing play, but, you know, that's not really the case in either format right now. So again, don't really think this one's likely to see play. And then Orzhov Charm, you know, again, I just don't think, I mean, the ability to use this as removal is pretty nice, but, you know, you lose life equal to its toughness, so at that point, you know, is it much better than a card like Dire Tactics if you're not running humans? I mean, you do get flexibility to be able to, you know, maybe if you've got a lot of creatures with mana value 1 or less, this could see play, but again, you know, I just think these are too underpowered to see play, other than maybe the Izzet one at some point, but I just don't think there's really a good home for it right now. The next time we've got Judge's Familiar, which, again, isn't a super exciting card. I do think this has seen some play in the Boros Convoke shell as just a cheap creature that enables you to, you know, fight on the stack slightly against the control decks, which, you know, I could see it seeing play in those sorts of decks. I've also always had, you know, a deck with a bunch of cheap flyers at the back of my mind because of stuff like, you know, Empyrean Eagle and the, I can't remember the name of it now, the Angel, where you can tap for creatures with flying to cheat it into play for 1 mana, but those decks have been, you know, basically unplayable for a very long time. So again, you know, if you're running Convoke, this is maybe an option, but I very much doubt this one's going to see much play in either format, unfortunately. The next one we've got Obzedat Ghost Council, which is, you know, it's an interesting card, but again, not only is it really expensive, it's also very difficult to cast, and I just don't think this is anywhere near good enough power level to see play, either in Explorer or Historic, unfortunately. So this seems like a kind of a weird inclusion to me. Similarly, Omnath Locus of Rage, again, not powerful enough to see play at, what is this, 7 mana, and also really difficult to cast. Now, I know this does see some play in Modern in the Glimpse decks, but which do look like really cool decks. I would love to be able to play that deck on Arena, but, you know, we don't have any of the pieces for that deck at all, so this is basically just unplayable again. And then The Chord of Shield, the card that just everyone lost their mind about, and I understand why. You know, all of these last cards that I've mentioned, including the Charm Cycle, just aren't good enough to see play. Similar with the Chord of Shield, like, I get that it's probably good in a deck like Cheerios that isn't really playable in either format. You know, we've got SRAM, which is nice with this, but we don't have, I think it's called Pure Steel Paladin, the other main enabler for those sorts of decks. And, you know, imagine trying to play Cheerios in a Bowmasters meta. Like, yeah, this does it seem like a very odd inclusion to me, right? I think a lot of this anthology specifically is air, and these last few picks seem like very odd inclusions to me. Again, you know, if we get Pure Steel Paladin in the future, it's nice to have a high density of 0-mana artifacts. Plus, you know, we do have Song of Creation, but again, you know, if you're trying to play that in Historic, you just get absolutely destroyed by Orcish Bowmasters. It's also just a very incredibly vulnerable deck, right? If you keep a hand with SRAM and the opponent thought seizes it and the rest of your deck is just 0-mana artifacts, you're just going to lose. So, again, don't really understand this one, and I can definitely see why people got upset about them including this. And then we also got another land cycle in here, which, again, doesn't seem very good to me. So we get 5 different lands from this cycle. I can't remember which ones they are, but I basically expect none of them to see play at all. These are like significantly worse than all of the playable ones. Like, Shock lands are better than this, Fast lands are better than this, Pain lands are better than this in most decks, Pathways are better than this in most decks as well. So, you know, if they reprinted these at uncommon or something, it could be potentially nice for budget decks potentially. But if you're building a competitive deck, we have so many better lands now that I really don't expect this one to see much play. So those are all the cards from the Explorer Anthology. So I think it's really a tale of two halves. I think the Historic Anthology is definitely worth getting, in my opinion. If you play a lot of Historic and you're interested in building decks with those sorts of cards, there's a ton of interesting cards that I do think could have an impact. And there are definitely some interesting cards here. I think Chord of Calling, Shrapnel Blast, and like it would be cool if the Lotusfield deck is playable even without Hidden Strings. You know, getting these two as creativity payoff seems pretty nice. And then the rest, it just seems not that great to me. So I'm definitely going to be getting the Historic Anthology. If I want to craft some of these cards from Explorer, like I'm definitely going to be trying out Chord of Calling and Yawgmoth, then I'll be doing that. But in general, the Historic one seems significantly better than the Explorer one to me this time round. Either way, definitely let me know in the comments what you think of them, if you're going to be getting either the Historic or the Explorer one. Definitely let me know as well if there are any applications of these cards or homes that I might have missed. Because, you know, at first glance, it's very hard to think of all the different considerations. So if you've thought of a cool idea or brew involving one of these cards, definitely let me know in the comments. I'd love to, you know, pick up your brews and try them out and stuff like that. But either way, I hope you enjoyed this set review. Excited to try these out, especially the Historic Anthology. And I'll catch you on the next one. Big up.